Hello, friends. Welcome. Today, I want to tell you about not an episode, but a recent panel discussion that Potential Paradigms organized with another organization known as Consciousness Hacking San Diego. The title of this panel was Artificial Intelligence, Creativity and the Unknown, the Promise and the Perils. It's no surprise to you that artificial intelligence is a big theme right now in the collective. We are all concerned and perhaps also excited about the potentials of artificial intelligence. So there are so many discussions happening on YouTube and on the television. So why this panel discussion and why watch it? So my simple answer would be that we didn't have any billion-dollar CEOs and politicians and or investors in this panel. So the conversation was very grounded and conscientious and also very creative. So if you're still watching this, let me quickly tell you about the panel. The first of them is Dr. Robert Twomey, who is an artist and engineer who has been working for more than a decade on the intersection of machine and human perception as to how new technologies, including AI and beyond AI, when they come and cohabitate with humans, what are the implications of that? What are the unknowns? And so when I heard Robert, I was really blown away by his insights that didn't seem to be present in the mainstream. So I think you will really enjoy Robert's insights. And one of his recent projects, for example, is a live radio play done in collaboration with artificial intelligence like the Chat GPT, helping to produce the script with humans and then live streaming it. And then the second panelist we have is Ted Chi. Ted is a senior vice president of a technology company, and he also leads an incredible community group known as San Diego Machine Learning. And I've attended some of their events, and the level of community collaboration and the level of education that is imparted in these free meetups was just mind-blowing to me. So that was one reason that I approached Ted, who is in the trenches working on this technology. And there is no fluff about him. He really grounds the conversation with his background in this tech. So that's a panel. I'm one of the people who helped organize this panel together as Potential Paradigms, along with my friend Zach Prager, who is a technologist and leads the San Diego Consciousness Hacking Group that explores the use of technology for human well-being. Since this panel has already happened, some of the questions that came up in the discussion to kind of whet your appetite and also see if you want to actually check out these questions. There are time points on YouTube which are also in the description, so you can click on them and just go to the questions that pique your curiosity. So some of the questions were, can AI be used as a collaborator? What are the motivations behind AI and human collaboration? Is there any influence of big money on AI? Of course not. Are we projecting our meaning and biases onto AI? Is the current AI based on technologies of plagiarism? What are the new paradigms that are going to emerge from these new technologies? Is there more value of human-made art now than before? Will AI eliminate jobs? What is the impact of AI on the new creators economy? Is there such a thing as AI literacy? Do we need regulation of AI? And how do we summon the unknown, both in art and also using this new medium of artificial intelligence? Why do new technologies spark a sense of terror in us? So this was a list of some of the questions. So I hope that you really enjoy this and learn something from this. At least that was my attempt. And I think that this was an enlightening conversation. And more important than not, I would really like to learn from the comments. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you can. I appreciate it. And thank you so much.
So the idea is maybe we'll start with Robert and he can speak for a little bit, and then we'll move to Ted and then open up the floor for question and answers, and we'll take it from there. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Kanan. And thanks everyone for showing up. It's great to meet the group. So I'll try to keep it short, but like Kanan, can I screen share? So as Kanan said, I'm kind of coming to this discussion as someone who's working in academia right now, but also as an artist, and I've really spent most of my life kind of exploring art and engineering in different ways. But actually, speaking recently together, Kanan, we talked about kind of the unknown and this element of the unknown in kind of in how we interact with models, maybe this future with like these new technologies that as they emerge, and also like what what of the unknown in ourselves do we, kind of encounter or explore through our interaction with these kinds of systems? So I guess the two things I want to talk about briefly, and I'll mostly just show some projects and kind of talk for a minute and keep it short. But where do we locate the unknown? Like in ourselves, in the world. What are the ways in which AI or these generative techniques or other kinds of like perceptive techniques are means to explore the unknown? And what are the ways in which an AI kind of is the unknown, especially these generative systems, that it's sort of is the unknown or channels the unknown in some way, maybe some massive aggregate of, 40 billion, web pages or whatever a model has been trained on. I think this idea of exploring the unknown is actually a pretty old one, in the arts. This is not that old. This is, the surrealist 1928, Robert Desnos. But this whole idea of sort of surrealist dream practice coming out of, Freudian psychology and the unconscious, but this idea that, artists wanted to access something outside of their kind of subjective control, their waking mind, their kind of conscious creative efforts, and tap into some other aspects of kind of creativity or potential or generation. So Robert Desnos was a poet who was a surrealist dream poet. He would write while he fell asleep or right when he woke up. So, it's all about sort of circumventing the usual conscious control of a creative or writing process. This spirit has existed in all kinds of different ways, kind of famously in maybe the 60s, sort of chance systems, aleatoric practices like John Cage, composing, or Merce Cunningham with his his choreography, or even more recently with like minimalist art, algorithmic art, and sort of things that kind of remove the human control of authorship in some ways and give it over to something, whether it's a system or a chance, or for me, really most intriguingly is like other dimensions of our own psychology, our sort of psychological orientation to the world. I think the other way to think about this is, like I said, sort of AI as the unknown. This is a photo of Harold Cohen, with his kind of lifelong project called Aaron, which was an AI painting robot. He basically instantiated his painting style in Lisp and used a CNC painting machine to produce a body of work for the last like 45 years of his career. I think what's interesting there is that, for him, there was something that was unknown or unknowable about the AI as the collaborator, that the system, despite the fact that he programmed it, would demonstrate some emergent behavior, or generate some images or other things that were kind of like, new to him as a way to encounter some version of his own approach to painting, or, flesh out some kind of new potentials in the craft. My own kind of explorations of AI began with this project about 18 years ago. As a kind of young master's student, it's called Mega How Grandmommy. My grandmother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I was just learning about chatbots and language models. This was a project called Mega How, which used hidden Markov models and would try to produce unexpected results, right? Like not the most likely predictions, but the least likely predictions. And in my conversations with the system, so the system learns from you, what you say, in my conversations with the system, I found moments of real kind of emotional saliency, but also a kind of randomness and disorder that's still characteristic, I'd say, of chatbots and ChatGPT and other kinds of more advanced systems. But for me, with my grandmother being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I characterized the system kind of with data about her, and the thing became a kind of interactive portrait. And to some extent, for me, as an artist, and it's important to kind of be cognizant and realistic about the limitations of systems or technologies, in addition to sort of embracing their, character or potential. So its failure was sort of poetically descriptive for me of my grandmother's mental decline. And over interacting with this over a number of months, it became this kind of interactive textual portrait and a kind of weird data capture of my experience and thoughts on her situation at that moment in time. That's kind of an old idea. People I'm sure here are familiar with Joseph Weizenbaum's ELIZA from 1966. One of the first sort of interactive text or chatbot programs he programmed it to simulate a Rogerian psychotherapist who just asks you like leading questions, and was totally disturbed with the degree to which people would get both emotionally involved with it and like believe that they were having some meaningful interaction. But he knew that it was kind of this dumb mechanistic rule-based system that was not like contributing sort of content to the interaction, right? That kind of idea of the the companion, the therapist exists today in different ways. I think maybe Replica.ai is a famous program, famous company now that's sort of working to make these AI companions. We've obviously seen like an explosion of these kinds of efforts since GPT-3 came out, and ChatGPT most recently. But for me, I guess like the ways that I've been interested in approaching AI are, in ways that we can kind of experience the limits of a model. So this project Solipsist was dealing with language models and speech recognition and playing with how like defining a small training data set limits the space of the model and limits the space of what's expressible. So it hears you according to its terms, but only in terms of the language that it understands or it knows. Also the ways in which an AI or generative system can kind of prompt a human. So, in this case, I trained something on a bunch of art, texts that I'd written about art in different projects to then use kind of the outputs of this text to generate some sort of quirky sculptural or graphical objects. That theme is kind of continued with a recent project called 3-Stage Drawing Transfer, where I've trained a GAN to generate images, so generative adversarial, like an image generation network to generate images of children's art. So training it on actual art from actual children, sampling from the trained model, having a robot render that image, and then sort of using that to prompt a human child to in turn like interpret it and respond to it. So both of these are sort of about, the ways that that we might look to a model to kind of, or a generative AI or something like that, to kind of prompt our own human creativity, as like a self-stimulation device or something that like moves us into, maybe an unknown space, but in a way that has some more kind of content or thematic coherence than like a pure chance operation where you're just kind of randomizing possible inputs. That we have a fiction about kind of like what's coming out of this system, that it like understands something about children's art, or it understands something about art descriptions, or maybe it understands something about, my grandmother's situation. So, the two ways I've been thinking about this are kind of this media mystic channeling. I don't know if you all have read this book or the others by Kay Alato McDowell from the Google Artists and Machine Intelligence program, but Kenrick. This was, I think, one of the first books published with GPT-3. It's really interesting. It's about kind of like environmental futures and other sorts of things, but it also has this tone of kind of trying to like elicit the truth or a statement or some poetry, from a model, where the human is sort of a supplicant, a medium, someone who's trying to sort of work with the system and elicit something that like aligns either with their own thinking or like pushes them into a new space. This is something I've explored with text and image. I'll wrap it up in a minute here, but I think what's interesting, if any of you have spent time with GPT or some of these text to image models like DALL-E or others, what boggles my mind as someone who started in like traditional like painting, drawing, and photography is just the vastness of the possible like output space here. And as like a creative individual, trying to make sort of discrete works of art or discrete experiences, how do we navigate this like vast space of latent potential? That I think that's a really, speaking to the unknown, it's like, it's a multi-dimensional, kind of space of possibility. And I think it's a different kind of situation to orient ourselves within as like thinking kind of subjective individuals, compared to sort of traditional ways of producing texts or images. This was a project that sort of explored that and made an analogy to the idea of the sublime from, landscape painting in the 1800s and 1900s, that the terror that people experience at the vastness of nature, and thinking about kind of the terror of the vastness of a of an image generation system. This was a performance. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of the more I've gotten into this, it's not so much like using a system as a mechanistic way of generating. It's really about sort of performing with, or authoring with, or writing with. This was the piece that Kanan mentioned at the beginning, this AI radio play. We're actually doing a new one in next month for a thing. But this event is kind of an 8-hour workshop where we compose what we call an AI writer's room. So like a writer's room you might find on a TV show or a kind of old school radio show or contemporary radio show, really. And kind of go from like prompts for humans to prompts for machines to extend the human writing, and then like intentionally prompting the machine to sort of seed the structure for a story. And then moving from that into producing like actual scripts that are really, really collectively co-authored, between, multiple human authors and multiple non-human authors, being kind of, GPT as a text generation system. These are live streamed and in broadcast, and it's the idea is we're going for kind of an episodic radio performance. Radio is a really interesting medium for working with generative text because radio is, sort of preeminently visual, right? Like paradoxically, right? Like that, in a way, it like kind of lets text do the most work. You can listen to it and sort of imagine what the text is conjuring, maybe in our own little text to image process. So I guess I just want to leave with like, for myself, questions that keep motivating me are kind of like, what are we trying for with, this is Robert Desnos again, but what are we trying for, for me as at least an artist, like in these interactions with an AI, is it something to do with escaping the self? And if so, like, why do we want to like escape or transcend our kind of limited, our subjectivity? Or is it a way to extend it, to find kind of like unknown corners, dimensions, angles, aspects, substance, in our own kind of psyche or creative sphere or whatever, that we're like finding new things to respond to that we didn't know like we would respond to, or is it about building a collaborator, and which raises all these questions, like, do we believe that these systems can have agency? Are they just a longer stick to paint with, like kind of a more complicated tool, but still it's sort of human directed creativity? And are we just collaborating with ourselves? When we build some technological system, we're collaborating with ourselves, or maybe with the tens of thousands or millions of uncredited authors who produce the texts that GPT is trained on, or the engineers who trained the model. And I guess, and finally for me, I think, I think it's easy to get to sort of novelty and engagement and excitement in working with these sorts of systems. And for me, like Kanan said, I'm really interested in this kind of machine cohabitation, or like art in intimate life. And so, I want insight into kind of the human condition. So I think for me, I'm really interested in sort of how do we get beyond kind of the frivolous or diversion or entertainment to some kind of like substantive involvement, whether it's like a large language model is not, a great model for like human language, but it can produce results that may resemble it, but ultimately I think I think we do want insight into sort of like, how we use language or how we create or how we imagine. So I will leave it there, but I look forward to the discussion. So, and let me stop my share. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering if we should just let anybody ask like burning questions about this presentation for a few minutes. Ted, what do you think before we?
Let me see if I can keep my remarks short. I don't have slides like Robert.
Yeah.
So I don't have anything to for you guys to look at. So I should probably keep it shorter, or lest I lose you. Okay. But so I think what I love your remarks, Robert. I think what I'd like to do is expand a little bit from the different things that you talked about into just looking at technology and the arc of technology. And I will say up front, right? So I'm an engineer, I'm a technologist. If maybe I'm a little bit too pro technology, then like maybe in the questions and answers in the conversation, like that'll expose some blind spots, give me some things to think about. But there's a couple things that I wanted to just highlight. So one thing is, when we talk about technology, there's all sorts of technology. And even when we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, there's all sorts of machine learning, and there has been for quite a while. So there are, machines that read the little numbers on the bottom of your checks, and they've been around for, I don't know what, 50 years, automate the processing and the routing of your checks to the different banks. I would argue that that is a machine learning model. And it impacts your life, but not all that directly, right? Right. So we have this FICO score model that decides how creditworthy you are. And that kind of impacts your life a little more directly, but still you don't interact with this FICO score model very directly. I mean, you might decide I am going to do this, or I'm not going to get that credit card because this might hurt my credit score, but you're not really, talking to it or whatever. Right. And again, there have been advancements on different fronts. So for example, in factories, there are a lot of tools that say, okay, I have a machine and it's making screws, and I'm going to have a camera, and the computer's going to decide whether or not this screw has a scratch, whether or not this screw is defective. It'll either reject the screw outright or just put it in a pile for human further inspection to decide, are we sure that, we put it in the good pile, or we're going to toss it and we'll melt it down, right? So from a technical perspective, in all of these cases, what we're doing is we're looking at the distribution of possible outcomes. So for the check writing machine, it's looking for, different marks that can be on the piece of paper and trying to decide, is that a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and so on. And the same thing for screws. Is this a well-made screw? Is it in any way scratched, too big, too small, too whatever, right? And so ultimately speaking, in a technical sense, what our models are trying to do is to identify the distribution of possible outcomes. And in many cases, we have particular outcomes that we're interested in. So you have images and you want to know, is it a cat or is it a dog? So that's the two things that you're interested in. Okay. Is this a well-made screw or a not well-made screw? Well, have we truly defined all the possible ways in which a screw can be malformed? You may find that, like, at some point, like, I've got a list of 20 things that could be wrong. And then at some point, someone's like, hey, it didn't reject this screw. And they're like, oh, we need to add a 21st way in which it can be wrong because it just wasn't looking for that as one. I say this because I'm trying to draw the similarity between something like a DALL-E model that generates images or a ChatGPT that generates text, because they themselves are also accessing this idea of finding a distribution of what we consider reasonable images of dogs, reasonable text, reasonable conversation. Okay. And the difference here, though, is that a predictive model that's just classifying cat or dog, you don't really interact with that much. Whereas a generative model opens up whole new possibilities. And so Robert, I really loved a lot of the different examples that you gave. And so, like, I often think about there was this quip that I heard. I'm sorry, I should probably have looked it up to see if I can find the right attribution. But somebody once quipped, the definition of technology is things that were invented after you were born. Okay. So, like, for me, electricity is not a technology. It's just always been there, but phones, that's technology because that's new, And so, but I do think that it's kind of instructive to think about that there have been different technologies, whether it was plows, tractors, electricity, you name it. And there's always been tremendous opportunity for good and for upheaval when we get these new technologies. So, so I would say, as an optimist, like, when it seems like, wow, these things are so new and scary, maybe you remember the story. This was an article from, I don't know, like there was an article in a magazine, and it was basically talking about this new technology that was threatening driver safety. Okay. With this newfangled device, people were going to be constantly distracted, and we were going to have car accidents all the time. And it was going to be this terrible thing. And again, I should have probably gone and found the link, the attributions I could send you. But if you read the whole article, it makes perfect sense. Makes absolute sense, right? Like I've seen people on their cell phone while they're driving, and it's a nightmare. Except that this article was like from 1930, and it was talking about the invention of the car radio. Okay. And so I think that it's instructive to see that we do have this innate reaction to things that are new, that we don't completely understand, that we don't have a handle on. But yet something like electricity might be very dangerous. I mean, if you look it up, the number of people who die from electrocution each year might, it's got to be more than that die from lightning strikes or from whatever. Yet at the same time, we may not really pause at all, because we just we're accustomed to that. That's sort of like the way the world already is. I've already paid the price of admission. I'm not going to not use electricity again. So therefore it's just, so that's not me saying, though, that there aren't dangers, there aren't risks. One of the things that I worry about most is that in our country, in the United States, it seems like the influence of money has sort of grown over the last however many decades. And so less and less do I have confidence that our governments are going to be able to regulate these technologies in sensible ways. We don't always know all the right things to do, but at least if we try to do the common sense things, I think that, 80-20 rule, we can get at least 80% of it right and try to refine. But if really the big money's doing the talking and we're not even doing the common sense things because of financial interests, that keeps me up more than just the fact that the technology itself is scary or something. So I think that's the one thing I wanted to kind of link between the broad arc of technology and a lot of things that Robert shared. And then the last thing I just want to say is I particularly find the ELIZA example to be instructive, because we sort of know that ELIZA is not really doing anything too interesting there. And so I would make the argument that ELIZA tells us more about how humans seek meaning in the world around them than it tells us about the meaning that the set of instructions for ELIZA was actually creating. And the biggest thing for me, I see lacking in a lot of the crazy conversations around what's going to happen with, these chatbots or whatever, is that if you're not rigorous, it's hard to separate those two. And so, one scientist I saw called for, hey, when you have a numeric measurement of intelligence, let me know and I will join the conversation. Okay. But if we don't even have a numeric scale from 1 to 10, then you and I can just keep arguing in circles about whether we think something is intelligent or is not intelligent. And I don't even know, to what extent am I truly making decisions of my own volition. I had to go to the drugstore the other day, and I was pulling into the shopping center. It's an all-way stop. And this lady blows through the stop sign when it was supposed to be my turn. And I'm like, okay, whatever, I'm going to let her go. And then the next car follows her right through, again without stopping. So at that point, I honked at the second car. I grew up on the East Coast. We honk a lot more than here in San Diego. But honestly, given my set of histories and memories and what I ate and all, my ability to have chemical responses. Did I really have volition to choose to hug or not hug? Or am I hardwired at this point where based on all of that past, all of that, you could just say like, it was, ordained that Ted was going to look at that car. There's no free will involved. So I can't answer that question about me. Then I feel like I certainly can't answer that question about a chatbot. So those are the kind of like the opening remarks. And then like, again, if people have questions, I'm happy to go more into the tech, but also like to kind of go back and forth on sort of this frontier of what it's doing, how we're perceiving and all of those things.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ted. The floor is sort of open if people have questions or comments and to Ted or Robert. I certainly have some.
I have a question for Robert.
Yes, please.
Robert, these ideas are really great, using AI to open up our creativity and which will help us create better things. So in your work, how do you define creativity when you work with a machine learning model, and how do you define it? Because machine learning model can spit a lot of results. And how do you differentiate a result as a creative product from another one? Or if I ask this question, let's say if we train a model with 1910s music type, right? Let's say we are training a model with that. And then let's say, can we expect a model to create hip hop, new style, right? For those people, 1910s, they don't know this exists. And even if it exists, will they like it? And is it creative? Is it a creative product? So how do you define that in your work? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say actually over the past few, actually not so much this year, but the 2 years prior, I had this collaboration with some researchers at CMU around kind of measurable creative AI. And we did some panels and workshops around that. We were looking at sort of like, can you come up with like a list of scoreable criteria that can measure creativity, in the human or the machine? And there are plenty of scholars of human creativity, that talk about like, there's like P-type creativity. There's creativity that like transcends the era, breaks the paradigm, all different sort of human definitions. But, machine learning engineers want to be in the world of like, cost functions and objective scores and things that are quantifiable to train models. That said, what fascinated me about that is I think it's kind of an ultimately quixotic pursuit. Like I think, what the reason I even gravitated to the arts over kind of like pursuing, getting kind of further into STEM was like wanting to do things that maybe, escaped some kind of clear, quantifiable definition. But I'll say for me, I think my definition of creativity in the use of one of these systems is like on the one hand, just as an artist in the world, I have, years of kind of bias and preference and predilection that are kind of baked into my practice and my particular kind of worldview and approach to creativity. So I'm definitely responding to things that like stoke that, if it's just a, like, what's my stimulation score, and it's an integration of all kinds of factors that I could talk about or, try to pick apart, but it's really just sort of a holistic response. That's one thing. I think the other thing is I don't know if it came through in the projects, but in working with technology, it's really key for me to like think about what it can do and what its limits are. And like Ted was saying, some kind of what's the rhetoric versus the kind of capability in some ways, we're so willing to project onto things. So I think, it's almost a little meta for me that like a creative use of a technology might be like a way that like reveals some aspects of the technology. It's sort of revelatory about that, while at the same time producing some of the novelty or stimulation or excitement or new ways of thinking that, that traditional art might. and finally, so that long answer, the last thing also is like, I'm kind of a hardcore humanist, that there's always going to be a human in the loop, that I think, like, no matter what, that someone programmed it, or it's trained on the data from, millions of painters or musicians from the 1900s, but yeah. So love to hear what Ted or Kanan or anyone else thinks, though, about kind of defining creativity.
So what I understood that you let the model to create some art, and then you're using your intuition to evaluate that if it is creative or not, or some artist, group of artists, or they're evaluating, and then that way the creative artist created. So on top of that, I can say that you can even train a model that learns what is creative for you, and then you can run on top of. So it's like it could be an ensemble model.
Yeah, totally. Or or like, what's it? Human something reinforcement learning, like, kind of going from GPT-3 to Chat GPT, human scores. Yeah, thank you.
So I think on a technical level, one thing I can share is people have what's the right word? Taken shots at large language models and said, well, they're just sort of like statistical black boxes that spit out words based on, probabilities, and, they do it in a convincing way. And I mean, given the example of ELIZA, like, we should always be cautious, right? Whether or not we are adding a lot of meaning to it beyond what, its capabilities are. However, I do think that we've seen enough studies now to be able to say that there is this phenomenon going on, in that basically these large language models are, even though they have lots and lots and lots of parameters, okay, so there's lots of levers in there in terms of, how it records information and decides what to do. If you look at something like, we talk about these n-gram models, okay, so if you say, if I saw the last 10 words, and I know those 10 words, what's the most likely next word that can come? And what if I knew the last 20 words, and so on and so forth, right? So what you can see quickly is that if you have a vocabulary of 10,000 words, which is actually a very small vocabulary, 10 to the fourth, a 10-gram model is going to require it to store 10 to the 40th different possibilities just to understand. And a 20-word model is going to require 10 to the 80th. And very quickly, what you will see is you've exceeded the number of particles in the known universe with just, a fairly short model. And now they have these models that have a history length of 32,000 words, tokens, technically, right? So clearly what the model is doing is it is compressing its understanding of, again, what word to say next. But in a way that's far more condensed than merely just some statistical probability. And I would argue that fundamentally compressing concepts is sort of what we define as knowledge. Okay. I can add any two 40-digit numbers. Even though there's 10 to the 80 different possible 40-digit numbers, what I have done is I've compressed it into an algorithm where I just do my, addition and my carries and my whatever. So I'm not actually memorizing all 10 to the 80 different possible combinations of numbers to add them. I'm just learning this little routine. So anytime you're really compressing the possibilities into a very small thing, that basically is knowledge. So whether I would give that kind of understanding human-like qualities or not, that's highly debatable. But I would say that these large language models clearly understand language and words and lots of things, and they understand that there are probably grammatically correct ways to say things in English, but nobody ever says it that way. There's just ways that we choose to use the language and express ourselves. And for the most part, these models, right? These bigger, newer ones, they're getting it right. They, You're not saying like, wow, that guy sounds like a foreigner. That computer sounds like a Martian. No, like that computer sounds like the guy next door and your coworker and your son. So in that sense, then tying this back to your original question, about creativity. So I do feel that these models are creating things. And if you give them a prompt and you say, write me a limerick, write me a haiku, write me a paragraph, a short story, that to the extent that it's not just sort of babbling words that are plausible, but it's using ideas and it's using, its understanding of what a good paragraph should be, its understanding of what a chapter should look like. I don't know how you can argue that it's not like, being creative at that point, whether or not it's the kind of creativity that like really spikes my meter or Robert's meter. Like maybe that's not, maybe some of these things aren't super interesting to me. But I would argue that, it has passed that level at this point where it understands enough to be able to be creative.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. So the language is very structural, right? But on the other hand, art is not that much that is, I'm not expert of art, but I think art is not that much structured and ruled like language. And then I understand that these models understand the context and then puts the words in sequence that makes sense within that context, and then it's grammatically correct. But when we apply the same thing into the art, which I'm not sure if I'm wrong, please correct me, Robert. Is there this kind of structure in the art? So it can create anything, and then thank you.
Yeah, I think I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I think, like early, like RNNs, early kind of like sequence learning models were good for like melody and some kinds of music generation because those are sort of very structural forms. I also think like early sort of generative image stuff, early like 8 years ago or something, like style transfer, we're doing things like adopting sort of surface level structure features, from a Van Gogh painting and applying it to some other image. So I think there's ways in which it's structural, but I think, like DALL-E and these things, what's really firing people up is kind of the vastness of the possible outputs in terms of like, remixing stylistic and content elements that kind of haven't encountered each other very much in the real world, which demonstrates some other kind of like Ted, I think the compression thing is really interesting. Yeah. So
yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. One other thing that comes to my mind, which perhaps connects with both what Ted said and Robert, you said, to me, my sort of path into the arts from engineering is rather recent, a few years. But I feel like one way I look at creativity is the contact with the unknown. And for more artists that I study and myself now, it is one of the most painful things, being an artist, to come in contact with the unknown. Robert, you were showing this image of, I forget the name of the person who was going into dream, and there's several others like DALL-E, and now we have a generation of people who are endeavoring into meditation and the spiritual arts and psychedelics, but it's the same old thing, and nothing new. But I feel like for an artist, what is original is something that's perhaps also original to themselves, that shocks them as something that they have received from the unknown, and then coming in contact with a medium, perhaps one that they are good at, to transmit it to the world, to culture. Anyways, yeah, that was just something that came to me. That's at least something that I struggle with, to how to make contact with the unknown. And it seems like it's always not on your terms. And the other comment I was going to make is what I found in both of what you were saying was that technology itself is kind of innocent in a way, but it's our application of it that can, turn it into Hiroshima and Nagasaki in one case, or wars, or I mean, it's perhaps the climate crisis and all the stuff that we're facing today. And in that sense, I think maybe both of you are hinting that this time is asking us to get our act together and maybe contemplate more of what it is invoking within us, and clarify that before we, use these technologies. So I'll stop there. But yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot could be said here.
That's what we're going to do with the 6-month moratorium on GPT.
Yeah. In an ideal world, that's what should happen. But, it's not. There's always going to be other incentives, as Ted was highlighting at the beginning.
So if I could just share a side comment, then we'll see if there's other topics that people want to go into. But like the idea of being an artist terrifies me a little bit, because if you're asking someone to do something original, but on the other hand, it can't be too original, right? I think if you were to show like modern 21st century poetry to Robert Frost, he'd be like, that's crap. You know what I mean? If you showed hip hop to some band from the 1910s, I don't think that they would be able to like expand and say like, oh, I can see how like this would be very original, and maybe, I don't know. And I think to a certain extent, if you took like a mathematician from UCSD and showed like Leibniz what they were working on, I don't think Leibniz could really appreciate it. It would just be so far outside of, that context. Even though we know now with hindsight that actually is useful and has applications for material science and whatever, like, no, like this is just crazy levels of abstraction beyond anything, So I think that is challenging, Kanan, to say, how do we anticipate what we don't know
I agree with that. That it's you can't know, it's an unknown for sure. But I would also say that from what you were saying is we do see in historically speaking, although we're constantly evolving, so we don't know. But you take Beethoven or Michelangelo, or I don't know, whoever, any Cantor or Albert Einstein or whoever. I think there are these, what I use the word is sometimes prototypes of individuals that have made an enormous contact with the unknown and completely brought a new paradigm that shifts everything. And in a very optimistic way, I would say that as we evolve as a species, we have more of those prototypes. It becomes commonplace. Like we'll have more Beethovens or Einsteins or whatever have you. But it does seem like that in every era, there are people who would radically introduce a new paradigm. And you mentioned Leibniz and Einstein, and part of the beauty about them is they're also part mystics. I feel like that's sometimes what empowers them, that they are interfacing with the unknown that allows them to bring in a paradigm that's nonlinear in their times. But yeah, it's totally unknown, and I think that's what freaks us out.
So I had a question, kind of following up on something Kanan had said earlier about, like any technology, there's good and bad usages and outcomes. And I certainly see a lot of potential for the way ChatGPT and GPT-4 can be used for things like coding and transformation software development, as giving one example. But even today, folks are kind of grappling with some of the challenging or difficult outcomes. And I'll use an example with art, I guess. So AI generated digital art is winning art competitions now, right? So I've seen lots of pockets in the artist community. Like there's a strong sense of sort of unease, distrust of these AI systems because they're concerned that, they've spent years and decades kind of developing their skills. Are they going to be replaced with these generative systems that have been trained on art? By the way, a lot of which the original artists had no say or opportunity to give their permission for it to be used as training data, right? So there's this feeling that, they're going to be replaced. Why are you going to commission an artist to make something when you can just have a generative system create something? On the other hand, some artists are using these systems to kind of, build out some draft storyboards or something, which they can then refine and kind of, it's a more efficient usage of their skills and time for the more difficult, I mean, I use that in quotes, like difficult aspects of the art, right? So I just wanted to, question for the panelists. What are your thoughts on these outcomes? Which is more likely to become like the main mode of operation into the future, or is it kind of both? I mean, these are going to coexist.
Yeah, those are I'll as the token artist, I'll jump in. But I think yeah, those are great touch points. Totally. I mean, I have colleagues in an art program who cannot draw for their life and are super thrilled to have tools to kind of like take things from a concept into an image, and run variations. There's a kind of like expansion of creative possibility that facilitates their human creativity, and like facilitates kind of the creative result. I think also, I mean, just like, photography being the death of painting, Photoshop changing film photography, that the tools are there. It's part of me is just like, I mean, even as someone who's like trying to work with this stuff all the time, it's exhausting, to kind of adapt, accommodate, learn, and so, I think, I don't know. I'm always interested in this dimension of like democratizing access, like ease of use, like sort of, how can we get things in the hands of a broader set of people, to kind of explore how to use it. I think that's sort of a way around maybe some of the anxiety of kind of like, traditional art like I need to learn these new skills. But I think, I mean, yeah, there's so much interesting. I've also thought about like maybe there's artisanal human-made art becomes a category, I mean, it already is, right? Like, I mean, it's sort of handmade objects versus digital objects or digital images. But yeah, I think those are great questions around kind of authorship, anxiety, creativity.
Yeah. I'll throw in, I take tremendous pause at the idea of whether or not people who build these models are taking other people's work without permission. So I think that's a very serious issue. To be honest, I'm not very optimistic on the outcome of that. It's like they say, once something's on the internet, it's like, it's almost impossible to delete it. So I think even if it shouldn't be, that a lot of people's work is going to get used in fashion. And then to use kind of like a computer science concept, I feel like the relatively brief history of computing is that we are constantly trying to move up the ladder of abstraction. So when I first started working with computers, a lot of people were still programming the computer directly in the language that the processor understood. So whether they were writing machine code or assembly code, pretty much the same thing. And then eventually, like if you could program in C, that was so much better than having to program in assembly. And then we learned kind of better ways to do C. And then eventually it was like, well, we should really do C++, and then kind of like moving things, up the ladder of abstraction. So it's kind of wild to think that like at some point you might be able to have a large language model that understands code, and you would just say, all right, let's start with a web server. And then like, boom, like the first 1,000 lines of code is just there. You know what I mean? And it's going to listen for this. And then it's going to have two types. It's going to have get and post requests. Okay. And here's the 4 types of gets that we're going to support. And then, and you can just sort of like describe this, like ultimately that I think would empower a lot of people. So I'm not very versed, with art, but I think that there will be an opportunity for artists to sort of move up a level of abstraction and to explore themes, usage, qualities of things, whether it's visual or other kinds of media, without necessarily having to have, like Robert said, the hand-eye coordination to actually do it themselves. so I think there's an opportunity there, but at the end of the day, yes, I think in general, technology, if it can be used, well, I'll say this simply, if it can be used to eliminate jobs, it will be. So with spell checkers, there probably used to be more copywriters at newspapers or magazines or whatever, and now there's fewer, and so there's going to be certain categories of more commoditized art. I do think people are going to lose jobs, but I'm hoping that the higher end, that people will still always look for that creativity and for sort of the new things that people are able to create.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I just wanted to make two quick comments. One is on the positive side. This is something I see as a trend, which probably all of us know is this buzzword lately, which is the creator's economy. And of course, at some level, it sounds superficial, but what I notice as a positive is that a possibility where at least every human can consider the possibility of being a creative person. So this is kind of like the zeitgeist where this seems possible. And yeah, just by having the latest technology in your hand does not necessarily make you an artist. I think there will perhaps be a Cambrian period of figuring it out. And this is probably a very complicated topic because it involves new financial models and economic models where can we as a species be only concerned with being creative? I think that would be an incredible scenario if that happens, where we are just being creative, which I think is probably the highest expression a human can have. So I don't know, that's being super optimistic. But the other quick thing I was going to mention from what Ted was saying, I agree with your point of view when you were earlier sharing of AI kind of being creative, because the space, just the sheer size of the space that you were sharing with this possibilities of production. But what just came to my mind was sometimes you hear a new musician who is using a very ancient classical music that doesn't have, all the electronic stuff, like an old sitar, it comes to me in the Indian classical music. And he does something incredible, which shocks even the older maestros, just because he had access to this analog instrument that requires him to perhaps interface with this technology in a much more intimate, and I don't know how to describe it, but I think that's also another aspect that maybe we miss out if we have such a vast space of these combinatorial technologies. Maybe there are other directions that we could have taken that we miss out. But I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm just saying maybe that's also potential mix.
So, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
Rob.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so, just to keep within the theme of this goodness and, good and bad in terms of, the pros and cons of the AI technology. I'm curious about your thoughts on, the ethical implication of using AI technology. So I'll tell you that as a scientist, we've been developing AI technologies and we're using it for, betterment of humankind. For an example, medicine is one of the aspects where we're using image technologies, AI technologies to kind of understand the disease mechanisms. But at the same time, we're also using this AI technology to, sort of develop this deep fake type of tools, right? So there is that ethical, conundrum that we see here. And as an educator, I will tell you that my biggest fear is, so we have this Chat GPT, and I always have this conversation with my grad students, are we demising our society by, having student access to it? And, how ethical would it be for them to do, like perform their homeworks, assignment, and things like that, right? So I'm constantly, debating. In one hand, I'm very, very, pro machine learning, technology development as a computer scientist. That's what I believe. And I think we should not stop, progressing just because, like what Ted was saying, electricity, we developed it, but, we do have some people dying from it. But, what does, it outweighs, the benefit outweighs what we see in terms of, the calamities that we see. So I was hoping that, you guys can, what's your insight in terms of, what are your thoughts? Like, should we, at what point do we want to create some kind of threshold and say, hey, do we need an oversight as to, let's ban this, for the high schooler or, middle class? Because I know in Italy, they have banned ChatGPT in school. So, would you please allude your thoughts on this subject?
So if you don't mind, I'd like to go first on this one.
Yeah.
Yes, go for it.
I am a huge optimist in this area. So first I want to say, like, yay, educators. Okay. So like the simple analogy that I would give is that probably 15 years ago, you could say like, wow, this essay somebody turned in had a lot of spelling mistakes, and this person got a D on that. Okay. I think today that paper would be an F, because it's like you have spell checkers. Like there's like, you should not be turning in, a paper with these kinds of obvious problems. Right. And so I actually am optimistic that today, a sort of very well-formed paragraph might be a D, but that someday it's gonna be an F, because it's like, dude, you didn't even run paragraph checker on your essay before turning it in. You didn't run GPT paragraph checker. Like, what was wrong with you, right? By the way, access to technology issues aside, and I'm not gonna, cover that. But so I do think though that there are going to be some people who will be challenged because there's areas in the humanities where like the essay is sort of a very well, utilized tool for asking a student to demonstrate their understanding. And so this will challenge them to say, how do I now elevate that discourse so that I'm going to have them demonstrate to me in a way other than this way that maybe worked for the last 50 years, maybe worked for the last 100 years. I don't know. But I'm optimistic that, it's going to actually ultimately, elevate the ability for educators to focus on understanding and meaning, and less so on the low-level technicalities of writing sentences and using proper commas, go Oxford commas, and, just things like that, right? So, but ultimately, when we get to the more bigger societal picture, what I worry about is that we don't have enough education, again, like trying to tackle the common sense issues, right? So right now there are scams, there's sorts of things, and like people need to be educated. You get this email, don't click on it, right? So there's going to be other layers of, oh, you saw this thing and it was the candidate for mayor of San Diego, and it's a deep fake. They didn't actually say that. Like, use your judgment. Like, do you actually believe that really happened? Maybe you should go check up on it. I worry that we won't really be educating our citizenry to understand this, and that the people who want to use these things will get away with it, as opposed to us just, like, there are really amazing spam filters right now. Like, 99.9% of the spam, gets eliminated before it makes it to your inbox. And so
why is my Gmail so bad?
I don't know if
I
you
need to
know how much
unsubscribe.
it actually got rid of before, but anyway, so yeah, so color me the optimist. I think that, and I do believe that we need more educators and more people, again, just talking about political stuff, but just common sense stuff about how to get, our people to be smarter about these things, so that, you don't make it easy for bad guys.
That was awesome. And also a great question, Shamim. I started off in like medical imaging, neuroimaging and stuff. So I love hearing about, I'm also like, wow, if we had convolutional neural networks, that would have been amazing. Working backwards from what Ted was responding to, I think or what Ted was saying, I think the idea of like kind of literacy is so important here. And it's like, we're already struggling with like textual literacy, other kinds of literacy, but like data literacy and now kind of AI literacy around like what does it mean, to like, how do we verify the output of like, GPTs? Like I just prompted it for a project for a list of 10 famous janitors, and like none of them were janitors. Oh, so kind of like, so just literacy around like actual capabilities, how these things operate, how do we verify the results? That's a huge challenge. But working back, and actually I want to ask you, Ted, about this, or anyone, but when you were speaking at the beginning, at the beginning of the event, we were talking about kind of like distributions of possible outcomes and either predicting or generating from distributions. And I wonder, like, are these ultimately normative, like within distribution in some way? And if we are becoming, I think it's really interesting to try to locate what's the kind of human contribution in a writing process. And especially if a tool like GPT can not only do spelling, but do like prose and do flow and do some kinds of like medium term structure. But, are those outputs like in some sense normative? Like, are they tending towards the distribution of like training samples? What does that do to sort of like human authorship in some way? Then my brain flips around in the same way you were saying earlier, Ted, about like, maybe I'm just a kind of normative predictor from my experiences and things I've read, but do you think it's interesting? Like, does working with generative models or relying on them to produce our utterances or our texts, does that kind of induce a sort of, normative influence on the things that people say?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. I can see, sort of the two sides to it. So on the one hand, I can say for some 80, 90% of your life, what you need language for is communication. You don't necessarily need it for like its rhetorical value. So if like I'm trying to write a memo to my boss to say, hey, I discovered there's this thing wrong with this machine. And if we fix it, then we can actually make 10% more widgets per hour. The rhetoric isn't really that important. It's just communicating that message. And so if I had the facts and I had a tool that helped me draft the memo, I don't really see a problem there. On the flip side, though, I do think, though, it's important for humans to be able to digest information and understand, and like understanding arguments is like a really important part of that. And so absolutely, you can't just become so like somebody who doesn't know how to add 2 + 3 and they just need a calculator to do everything for them. And they have no idea of numeracy, and they don't know numbers, and they don't know that 1,000 is a much bigger number than 5. That's a problem. Okay. So if they say, 1,000 people died in a train accident, they should understand that's much more horrible than if 5 people died in a train accident. Like, if you don't have those skills, there are skills that I also not as well versed in when it comes to being literate. And I think it's very important not to lose those. And I'm not sure, how do you make sure, like as an educator, like say K through 12 or whatever, that you empower them that maybe memorizing spelling is not as important because you have aids in your life for that, but you still have to be literate overall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this discussion. So, so my concern is really towards the students who are learning, right? Because we wanted to make sure that they're learning with rigor, the rigorous, the foundation that we put in. I want them to understand how linear, algebra works, how this function works. But now with ChatGPT, which I just found out yesterday with my grad student, you could put in a differential equation and it gives you step-by-step explanation and it solves the problem. So that's where I'm thinking, oh my goodness, when we took optimization class as a student, it took us, a couple of days to figure out the, solution. And here I have within a minute with the explanation. And here I am, so I'm actually, I have 20 plus years of language modeling background. That's really what my research was as a grad student. I will tell you, the idea was that we wanted to use this to not just only progress technology, but really use it for human benefits, right? And here I am, I have students, and I'm thinking, I don't want my student to come in and say, hey, I don't know anything about programming, but I have ChatGPT to do all of this for myself, right? So where is that ethical, part where we say, you can't you can't instill ethics to people. That's a problem, right? So I think as a society, that becomes a bit of an issue that we need to talk about, right? So plagiarism it's going to be a big factor, which we don't want to, as an educator, something that we don't really want to deal with, but we have to now start having this conversation. So as a society, I think that, of course, there's benefits for all these technologies, but I just think, should there be some rules, regulation, like oversight? Can we instill some kind of regulation that says, here's what you should be doing, where when we were learning how to add and subtract, you're not allowed to use calculators just so that you can develop that fundamental, skill sets. So is it something, and I truly feel as a, computer scientist, that we need to have those kind of conversation and see, what would be the threshold? Where can we instill those kind of, ethical and, sort of like, things that will become normalized, right? Something that is not, oh, you're doing it wrong. And I mean, I'm just looking at it. There's a can of worm that we're opening up. And I'm an AI person, so I'm saying this. So imagine people who don't know how AI, technology works. I mean, of course, they're trepidating, right? About the craziness that all this, the power of using AI technology, specifically the generative models. So, I just think that there has to be a conversation where we can talk about the ethical aspects of it, and are there, oversights or regulation do we need to kind of implement, just to kind of, as a society, so that we don't go, off tangent.
Yeah. So if I could say, I think absolutely, like, plagiarism is something that there should be bright lines on. Okay. Is this work that you did completely on your own? You did assistance or not? Okay. And in some areas, work with assistance is completely allowed. So like, yes, you're allowed to use a calculator in chemistry class in order to do your addition and your multiplication and whatever, because they're not expecting you to just by longhand do the grams per mole, blah, 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 blah. Right. But I think that, again, the optimist in me says, this is a challenge to you as an educator. Okay. If somebody's going to say, calculate the determinant of a 5x5 matrix, it's very tedious, very time consuming, and I would argue kind of boring. If I allow them to get assistance so that it's not as tedious and not as boring, are they still going to learn the concept of what are the sort of, the properties of a determinant, in terms of like it being permutation invariant and other things? Like, can I teach those things without forcing them to do all this stuff longhand? And I don't know the answers to that. I'm hoping that will be sort of the new bar for educators, for whether in the humanities, to say, how do I do it other than just the old essay way? And for this, for linear, how do I have problem set? Is it just that I got to police the test so that, you can't cheat? And so then if you don't really do the homework, then you'll just deny yourself the opportunity to learn, because then when the test comes, you're going to be in big trouble. Or is there a way we can kind of find a way to raise the bar to say, yes, you're allowed to use the calculator to add and multiply, but you shouldn't be doing the whole thing, because then you're not going to learn,
Right. No, I know it's a gray area. So, I was just hoping that we could just initiate this conversation that I think we do need to, talk about this.
I think the idea of a ban is probably, maybe you do that, you do some temporary moratorium if you're trying to figure things out. But in the long run, I think that's just untenable. So I think you have to come up.
I also agree. Banning would be a detrimental, part for, technology development side. But I think, like I said, some form of regulation, of like maybe, K to like, certain middle school age, you're not. We wanted to teach you how
Right.
to write properly.
Right.
I
Just like
wanted
you
to
shouldn't be
teach you the
using a
fundamentals.
calculator in
Exactly.
first
That's
grade
right.
math when
That's
you're
right.
learning basic
That's right.
addition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And it's going to be challenged. Like I've been more and more surprised since I've seen these models, how well they're able to do programming, very
Yep.
basic programming. And so
Yep.
I don't know how you're going to teach introduction to programming. You know, even if we say that people will now get elevated where they can work at a higher level, at some point you have to at least go through the basics.
Right. Exactly. And
And
we have
now-
an aging population, right? So we will decline, retire. I want the new generation to come in and they understand the concept of, rigorous programming, whereas we're the object-oriented programming, right? Things like that. We just cannot. And this is going back to what I was saying, demise of the societal, the learning process. I want to make sure that we still instill the rigorousness of the fundamentals within the students so that, we don't lose the sight because, like I said, we have to train.
So I think the challenge to educators is, how do you teach people to understand without necessarily requiring that they do?
That's right.
Right? So if you're teaching agriculture, how do you understand what is good and what works for growing plants? But you don't necessarily have to force them to sit there and grow the plants. Right? You need, right? So we're going to be faced with, I think, a lot of these challenges. Can we find a way to teach and test for understanding?
Right.
And riffing off that, like, those haven't been super separable, in essay writing and things like that previously. I think that's, it's really interesting. So.
And within my family, I see that I banned it from my son because he's using, and he's very short-term goal oriented. He procrastinated and he just wants to turn in the homework and he doesn't care how it's done, right? And he doesn't know how harm he's bringing to himself. And I try to explain him, he won't learn. And during the exam, there won't be any ChatGPT, all that needs to be explained. No matter what.
That's right.
He's directly going towards the ChatGPT and he's begging for it. So I banned it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, of course, this is a complex subject, but I just wanted to bring up another thing that comes to me, which is that I'm not so sure that the current educational system we have, at least in the West or the Western civilization, is very much based on the rational qualities of the mind. And there are other, like, for example, in the Indian continent, there was a huge, emphasis on the trainings of the martial arts. You can look at that in pretty much all Asian societies, the arts, the music. And when I think about, okay, what is that can be skipped in those trainings? There's so much more happening there, the building of the character, for example, and cultivation of wisdom. And when you're placed in situations, it's not just all mental strategies and logical sequence of things. There is something else that's cultivated that I think would not place us in the ecological and other kind of challenges that we are placed into. So I'm not saying this is a either or, but I think shouldn't we not have an education system where people follow what they are naturally inspired to? Why should we expect the worst of children? Right? Everybody does not have to be an engineer. This became a thing in India, for example. You either, by a Western influence, either have to become an engineer or a doctor. If you're not any of those two professions, you're worth nothing. And this also goes back to when we talk about copyright and patents, it's all competitive. It's mechanisms of, it's colonial mechanisms that we've already seen how colonial, invasions happened in a lot of indigenous civilizations or cultures, and that continues here with our current corporate structure and how law is designed and policy is designed. So I think it's there is that aspect too. Maybe all of that needs to go away, and maybe there are other models of being, having apprenticeship models, and not everybody has to be the best. Maybe we just need 20% of us to be good at growing food or actually having some contact with nature and some appreciation of nature and rest of us will have food to eat. But anyways, yeah, this is complex, but I just wanted to bring that in, that I think there is something problematic with the education system.
Yeah, thanks, Kenan. That was really well said. Yeah.
I'll say maybe riffing off that, I spent a lot of time in experiential learning, like whether in the arts or kind of engineering sorts of things, that are about doing, making, trying, kind of seeing what the results are. So I do think there's something, maybe even to what you were saying about computing working with matrices, something about like being able to run a lot of possibilities through and see how rotating the elements or whatever changes or doesn't change the output is a kind of experiential learning. So I do think things becoming computational or computable or, generatable in some ways gives you a different kinds of fluency and understanding of, like, say, how text operates, to be able to produce a variant of a text from a prompt. Maybe there's a different kind of learning that occurs about like how text works. So I think maybe Kanan's saying like it doesn't have to all to be kind of like, I don't know if it's Western book learning or, kind of like, blue books and, closed textbooks. But I think, there's some interesting possibilities there.
I want to ask one last question to Robert. So, do you have, put it this way, can you show us any examples of the creative AI creative product that just you appreciate a lot, just fascinates you a lot? For me, it was like the music Genesis from AI technologies. This music symphony was really touching for me. I really loved it. I kept listening. Do you have any piece of art like that? Just you like it a lot?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm really partial to text in different ways, so I enjoy like the book I showed from Kenrick Olado McDowell. I think I like these things that feel like a dance or duet or interaction between kind of a human author and some kind of a machinic system where like, that book is one example, which I would recommend to people. So called Pharmaco AI. And then I think I'm still kind of stuck on like early GAN art, like Mario Klingemann and things like there's something fascinating about seeing like images at their most plastic. So, he has these projects that are like interpolating between, moving through latent space and generating like kind of contiguous and related face images and things like that. And I think there's something, that is still fascinating to me about seeing like a space of generated images that like step to step are very similar, but over like a long interpolation will shift, that it's just a different way of thinking about images, that is not sort of a traditional art historical or creative approach. So that's Mario Klingemann. I think one is like Memories of Passerby 2 is one if you want to look it up. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask a question if nobody's asking. Actually, it's to both of you. And you actually both of you used this word, but maybe in different contexts. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit into it. And that is the word of emergence. I think maybe Robert, you used it in terms of emergence of new forms of art mediums or ways of interfacing with the unknown. And I believe, Ted, you used that maybe as hidden emergent systems. I don't know if you're hinting at that inside LLMs or technologies in general. So since I have both of you, maybe you could address it in your own unique way.
You don't seem to be jumping.
I'm looking at Ted, but he can't see me looking at him because we're in a grid. Yeah.
So I can go first. So there's some very interesting things people are discovering as they're building large language models right now. I personally am kind of the opinion, well, I think pretty much nobody thinks that the models we're building today, like GPT-4, work the same way as the human brain or animal brains. Okay. So nobody really thinks that, right? Now, what's interesting is it may be able to actually duplicate the capabilities, but nobody thinks it actually works the same way, right? So it may turn out that if we come up with a different technique, it'll be far more efficient. And in the end, they humped out that GPT thing was so inefficient. It was so brute force. Oh my God, I can't believe they did it that way. But nevertheless, there is currently in business this idea of the sort of hardware lottery. And so basically, if something works a little bit, then people are going to chase it with more dollars. And so right now, the language models we have, there are enough people who are willing to invest money to build ever bigger, hopefully more capable ones. And what they've noticed is that if you have some simple property like if you ask this model to predict what is the sum of adding two numbers, okay, that sort of gets smoothly better as the models get better. That's great. But the other thing that they're discovering is there's certain things that the small models basically just get a 0 on. They just can't do it at all. And then when you reach a certain size, all of a sudden, then they are able to do that. And so in particular, some of the reasoning kind of things we see. So if you try and give ChatGPT, a word problem, Sally had 12 apples. Sally gave 9 of them away to her friends. Then she went to the store and bought 24 more. How many apples does Sally have now? Right? That below a certain size, they're just utterly incapable of doing it. And then all of a sudden they become able to do it. And I don't think anybody has any, well, I don't know, maybe, there may be theories, but there's certainly no conventional wisdom that can explain what is this? Why is it only emergent at a certain size? What's going on here? Okay. But the really interesting question is, well, if we've already discovered that these things emerged when you got to 1 billion, could it be that there's something that's going to emerge at 5 trillion when we just get a little bit bigger? And will that be completely awesome? Right. So that's one place where people, really are talking about emergent properties. And I do think that the other thing I want to kind of connect this question to, though you didn't ask about this, is that I feel that the large language model moment in AI is a little bit different from the other advances that we've had in AI. And the reason for that is because human beings invented language for the purpose of being a universal communication medium. Okay. Ultimately, if I'm going to computer program, I want to be able to talk about it in English. If I'm going to create art, I want to be able to talk about it in English. And I want to say something about how you do the brush strokes and what colors you choose. And I might even make up a new word for, I don't know what, for the iridescence, the contrast, the whatever, in music, you have counterpoint. At some point, the word counterpoint didn't exist and someone invented that word so that they could express this concept. So I feel that the universality of language is going to have this be a bigger moment than other moments. And you're starting to see now these multimodal models that can handle audio, that can handle images. And I think that's going to work really well. And it's going to continue to work well, specifically because we created language to be universal. So if I have a model that can tell cats from dogs, how do I communicate to the model that I want it to tell the difference between foxes and wolves? I don't have a way of telling it that. But when I have a language model, I can just explicitly say, oh, wow, you were just trained on cats and dogs, but now I want you to try your hand at foxes and wolves. And it may do well or not well, but at least it knows my intent because it understands this. So that's where I think the emergence, we're going to see some very, very interesting uh, models and properties emerged simply because, in theory, with language, we have a way of describing anything that we want the model to do.
That's great. I've thought about, language as like a universal solvent or something, is like a kind of a low representational language for all these other kinds of media. And yeah, we're like equipped to interpret language. And so I think when you're playing kind of the perception of a model against the thing you're asking it to do or the task, that if the output's language, then there may be like you said, almost like new descriptions that come out of a model that are not how we would describe it, but that are interpretable in some way. I think, I thought about emergence, I guess maybe in a couple ways, but one that I've been thinking through for the past minute is about, kind of like interspecies design. I'm not sure we can call language models species, but, human, non-human interaction, or you can think about it as like cognition in the wild, distributed cognition kind of things, but, how thinking can happen between multiple people or actor network theory, people talk about like between people and objects and, other kinds of things. And so when I think about emergence, I do kind of think of it in like a cognitive or creative sense or something, or it could be, dance improv, but that kind of like behaviors, formulations, expressions that emerge from almost like a networked interaction between whether it's a human and a non-human, which could be a language model or could be, a puppy or something, but that there's new kinds of expressions or behaviors that emerge from that collective system. I think this, I think also about aliens, like an alien subjectivity, an alien just being like the other as in not me or not you, that in asking, say, a image captioning model to describe an image, it has a kind of subjective, based on its data and structure, interpretation of that image, and you can show it other things, and that's an interesting place to be, to kind of see what a thing like that, what a model will come up with about, some novel stimulus or kind of some strange task. So.
Yeah, you just reminded me of something. When it comes to like art and interpretation, I mean, like I said, the idea of being an artist seems kind of scary to me. I remember reading this one paper, and they were criticizing vision models. This is probably about 2-ish years ago, and they said that these models were too dependent on texture. Okay, and they showed as an example, I think it was a picture of a lion. It's obviously a lion with zebra stripes. Okay, and they're like, this computer model like said it was a zebra, and like obviously it's a lion. You can totally see the shape. It's a lion, right? But I read that and I was just like, well, but isn't that really just sort of your preference for shape outline over texture?
Yeah.
Like, who's to really say that that's the right prediction?
It has a strong zebra spirit, that lion. Yeah. Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? So, and so then, yeah, like, maybe if whatever the art equivalent of that is, you decide to do something a little bit different, and you think it's this amazing zebra concept, and somebody else is just like, that's a really lame lion, Robert,
So stinging critique. Yeah. I apologize, Kanan. I think I need to go tend to some family things, but
Okay.
I
Thank you so much.
yeah, I would like to thank you all for spending this time with us and for the thoughtful questions, and great to be speaking with you, Ted and Kanan. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Kanan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to both of you for, and everybody else to making time on a Friday evening. And I know both of you are also very busy. This has been very enlightening. And I think at least we weren't going into all the hype. We kept the answers naturally grounding, because there is no shortage of
Yeah.
AI conversations and news these days. Yeah. So thank you again. I'll post this up on YouTube on Potential Paradigms and email all of you. And look forward. Yeah, please check out Ted's meetup. And Robert, you have your website, roberttwomey.com.
Yep.
People can check further.
And I'm happy to follow up with anyone who wants to chat more, but this was wonderful. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. Okay. Have a good night.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for hosting this, Kenan. This is a really interesting conversation.